In the hills of Appalachia, whispers carried by the wind speak of a house that should never have been, a place where the lines of family blurred, where father did not remain father, where daughter did not remain daughter, where brother became something else entirely. For generations, the world outside never knew, or perhaps never wanted to know, what was happening within those rotting wooden walls. What begins as rumor becomes record, and what was record became buried so deep in shame that even the soil seems unwilling to give it back. But it happened, and tonight you will hear it. A family so trapped in itself, so broken by isolation, that even blood began to betray them. The story begins not in wealth or power, but in hunger and silence. Families in the forgotten valleys lived with nothing but their own kind, generation after generation. Roads barely reached them, schools never mattered, and churches passed them by. They were left alone with themselves, and when the world looks away long enough, monsters grow in the dark. In this house, there were no outsiders, no fresh faces, no future beyond what already sat at the dinner table. And when a father looked upon his own daughter as though she were the only woman left in the world, the curse began. At first it was one secret, a father crossing the line that could never be uncrossed, a daughter silenced by fear and shame, unable to run because there was nowhere to run to. But secrets, in families like these, never stay contained. What began as one twisted act spread, until the brother followed the father, until sister became something else entirely, until the words mother, son, father, and daughter lost all meaning. They became a house with no boundaries, no laws, no way out. And their blood began to tell the story for them, for when the children were born they carried the marks of the sin, faces that looked too similar, minds that never grew right, bodies bent and broken by the endless folding of the same bloodline onto itself. The town would whisper, calling them strange, cursed, not right. But no one came to save them. No one pulled them out of that house. The world let them rot where they were, because maybe, deep down, the world knew it was easier to forget them than to confront the truth of what families can do when no one is watching. And so, the most inbred house in history was allowed to keep breathing in the dark, its doors closed, its windows shut, its secrets festering. A family tree that curled inward, strangling itself, until the leaves turned black. The deeper you look into their story, the more the silence itself becomes unbearable. Neighbors knew something was wrong. Children who strayed too close to the property would come back whispering of faces that looked twisted, of voices that didn't sound like any they had ever heard before. Some said the children in that house barked instead of spoke, that their movements weren't quite human, as though generations of broken blood had reshaped the body into something else. It was easier to laugh at the rumors than to confront them. But the laughter always faded quickly, replaced by that heavy hush, the kind of silence that hangs when everyone knows the truth but no one dares say it aloud. This was not just a family. This was a cycle. A father took his daughter because no other woman would ever come to him. A son then took his sister because no other girl would ever exist in his world. The act repeated over and over, each generation forgetting what the words husband and wife even meant. They became meaningless roles absorbed into the same collapsing bloodline. What should have been forbidden became routine. What should have been shocking became tradition. Imagine growing up in a house where every adult around you shares the same set of features, the same vacant look, the same broken language. Imagine being told this is normal, that this is all you will ever have. But blood has memory. It does not forget, and it punishes. By the third generation, the toll was undeniable. Children born with eyes too close together, jaws that never set right, bodies that couldn't hold themselves steady, minds that lived in confusion, unable to understand why they were different, only feeling the weight of that difference when outsiders looked at them. Some records describe them as mute, others as animalistic. And still, no one intervened. For the world beyond those hills they were a curiosity at best, an embarrassment at worst, a stain no one wanted to claim. And so the house kept collapsing inward until even language broke, until the family was no longer capable of telling their own story, leaving only whispers, photographs, and the occasional visit from a horrified outsider who swore never to return. It is here, in this silence, that the true horror of the most inbred house reveals itself, not in the grotesque features, not in the twisted lineage, but in the unbearable truth that they were left to become this way, abandoned by a society that looked away. There is something almost ritualistic about the way this family devoured itself. Every generation was a mirror held up to the last, and each reflection grew more distorted. A father no longer saw his daughter as his child. He saw her as continuation. A brother no longer saw his sister as blood. He saw her as obligation. There was no ceremony, no marriage, no vows, only the quiet acceptance that this was how things had always been, and how they always would be. In that house, sin was not rebellion. Sin was survival. And yet survival came at a terrible cost. Those who were born from these unions were often trapped inside bodies that betrayed them. Some could not walk, some could not speak. Others lived in a fog of half-awareness, unable to name the world around them, yet fully aware of the shame carried in the way outsiders stared. These were children who never had a chance, never had a choice. They were born into a prison where the jailers were also their mothers, their fathers, their siblings, and when they grew older, they too became both prisoner and jailer, keeping the cycle alive. The house itself became a character in this nightmare. Its walls sagged with time, its wood rotting, its windows covered not to keep the world out, but to keep their world in. Visitors who dared step inside spoke of the overwhelming stench, of the disarray, of rooms where children huddled in silence, eyes darting toward the floor as if afraid to meet another gaze. There was no laughter, no songs, no life, only breathing, eating, existing. An entire lineage trapped in a loop, spiraling further inward with every generation. What makes this story unbearable is not just the horror of what they did, but the absence of anyone who tried to stop it. Where were the neighbors, the churches, the authorities? Why was no one willing to pull them out of the pit they had dug themselves into? Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was disgust. Or maybe it was because confronting them meant confronting the darkest possibility of all, that any family left alone long enough, cut off from the outside, could turn inward and become just like them. This is why their story lingers, passed down in whispers, retold in horror, because it forces us to ask questions we do not want to answer, about isolation, about shame, about bloodlines that should have ended but did not, about the silence that allowed them to go on. As the generations piled upon one another, the children born inside this bloodline became living proof of the family's collapse. Outsiders described them as misshapen, their features blurred together as if the body itself had grown tired of trying, eyes that didn't quite align, mouths that struggled to form words, hands that curled inward as though clenching against some invisible weight. To see them was to see the story written, not on paper, but in flesh. The punishment was carved directly into their bodies, their blood unable to carry the burden of its own repetition. And yet, there was no escape for them. The world beyond their house did not welcome them. It mocked, it shunned, it recoiled. Children from nearby towns would dare each other to get close, to catch a glimpse of the mutants who lived in the valley. The family became folklore, something to be pointed at from afar but never understood. The more grotesque the rumors became, the more invisible the humanity inside that house grew. They were no longer seen as people. They were seen as warnings, a living example of what happens when bloodlines collapse. But what none of the outsiders wanted to admit was that this wasn't just about biology. It was about abandonment. No one wanted to claim responsibility for them. No one wanted to say, "These are our neighbors, these are our people, this is our failure." It was easier to turn away, easier to let the house sink into itself, generation after generation, until the family became something other than family. Imagine for a moment being born into that house, waking up every day and knowing that your world begins and ends within those four rotting walls. The same faces, the same voices, the same routines, endlessly repeating. You're told these people are your parents, your siblings, your children, but the words feel hollow because none of them mean what they should. Imagine the confusion, the helplessness, the quiet horror of realizing that your bloodline is not a tree reaching upward, but a noose tightening around itself. This is why their story haunts us. It is not just the grotesque image of what they became. It is the suffocating awareness that they were trapped, born into chains made not of iron, but of blood. Chains they did not forge, but chains they could never escape. And every child born carried those chains heavier than the last. If you're still here listening, you're already braver than most. Most people turn away by now. They don't want to know how far this story goes, how deep the rot really runs. But you do. And so we continue. By the 5th and 6th generations, what remained of the family barely resembled what it had once been. Words dissolved into grunts and noises. Some of them no longer spoke at all, communicating instead with gestures, cries, or sounds that unnerved even the few outsiders who dared to visit. A sheriff once recalled trying to question one of the sons. Instead of answering, the boy barked, not once, not as a joke, but as his only form of expression. A sound carried down from a bloodline so fractured it no longer remembered what language was. These were not monsters by choice. They were human beings, trapped in the body of a family that refused to die. And yet, the world insisted on calling them monsters anyway. They were the subject of ridicule, of whispered legends, of cruel laughter. Children in nearby schools would be told, "Don't end up like them." They became less than human in the eyes of those who watched from a distance. But the truth, the unbearable truth, is that they were human. Broken, silenced, reshaped by forces beyond their control, but still human. Inside the house, survival meant submission. No one dared to question the cycle, because questioning it meant facing a truth too large to hold, that they were born into a lineage doomed before they ever took their first breath. Daughters were raised knowing what would be expected of them. Sons were raised knowing what they would be forced to take. And when the moment came, they did what their fathers and mothers had done, because that was all they had ever known. It was not desire. It was not rebellion. It was inevitability. When the rare outsider stepped onto the property, the reaction was always the same, me. The family would retreat into the shadows of the house, peering through cracks in the wood, too ashamed or too confused to face the world, and the world in turn left them to their shadows. For decades this cycle went uninterrupted. For decades no one asked why, no one asked how, no one asked what might happen if the bloodline was allowed to keep folding inward forever. The final chapters of this family's story read less like history and more like a ghost tale that refuses to fade. By the time outsiders began to document them seriously, the damage was complete. Generations of collapse had stripped away nearly everything that made them recognizable as a family. They were not just poor, not just isolated, they were cut off from the very language of humanity itself. Photographs show faces blank and distant, children slouched in silence, adults with eyes that never meet the lens. The camera captured not just their appearance, but their absence, an emptiness that no word could fill. What happened inside that house cannot be undone, and perhaps that is why people still whisper about it today. It stands as one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding in history, not because of one act, not because of one sin, but because the cycle never stopped. It went on until the bloodline could no longer carry the weight of itself, until the family became a warning carved into the flesh of its own descendants. And yet, beneath the horror, lies something even darker. The silence of the world that watched, the neighbors who shrugged, the officials who ignored, the communities that turned their backs. This was not just the story of a family, it was the story of abandonment, of what happens when people are left to wither in their own shadows. They were mocked, They were pitied, but they were never saved. Their suffering became a spectacle when it should have been a rescue. Today, the memory of that house lingers like a scar. Some call it cursed, others say it should be forgotten. But forgetting does nothing. Forgetting allows it to happen again, in other forms, in other houses, behind other doors. The lesson of this family is not just about bloodlines, it is about neglect, about what silence breeds when no one intervenes. So when we speak of them, when we whisper their story in hushed tones, we are not simply retelling a grotesque piece of history. We are staring into the mirror of what humanity is capable of when isolation, shame, and silence are left unchecked. The most inbred house in history is not just a family lost to itself. It is a reminder that sometimes the worst horrors are not born in the dark. They are allowed to grow there. And so we arrive at the end, though the echoes of this story never really end. The house may have rotted away, the names may have faded from records, but the bloodline remains etched into memory, a scar that refuses to close. Some descendants escaped, carried away by time, scattered into places where the past could not follow. But those who stayed, those who lived and died within that cycle, became part of a legacy too heavy for one family to bear. Their bodies carried the story. Their silence carried the story. And now, so do we. There is a reason this tale feels forbidden, as if we shouldn't be speaking it aloud, because in telling it, we strip away the comfortable illusions about family, about safety, about love. We see that even the most sacred bonds can be broken, twisted, and turned against themselves. A father who should protect becomes the destroyer. A brother who should shield becomes the predator. A house that should shelter becomes a trap. And the family name, once meant to carry pride, becomes nothing more than a curse passed from parent to child. But the deeper horror is not only what they became, it is what they reveal about us, about how quickly we avert our eyes from suffering when it becomes uncomfortable, about how society abandons the forgotten, the poor, the strange, until they become something unrecognizable. The most inbred house in history did not create itself in a vacuum. It was shaped, little by little, by a world that chose not to see. And so, as you step back from this story, ask yourself, was this family a monster, or were they the victims of a monster larger than themselves? A monster called isolation, a monster called neglect, a monster called silence. Their story is a mirror, showing us what happens when no one intervenes, when shame replaces compassion, when the suffering of the few is ignored by the many. The house is gone now, the valley is quiet. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The faint, broken echoes of voices that never had the chance to be whole. They are asking the same question we are left with now. How many more forgotten families will be buried in silence, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally see them?